Now, the BBC has been widely condemned and criticised throughout Israel's genocide, including, I have to say by myself, for its coverage of Israel's genocidal onslaught against the Palestinian people. There was a rare exception, apparently, when the BBC did a documentary which humanised Palestinians. It focused not least on the experience of children. We've witnessed one of the great slaughters of children in some form of armed conflict. It being so asymmetrical, that term's slightly problematic, but of our time. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of children, at least 1,100 babies have been slaughtered. So children's experience shown, and then there was a big backlash to take the documentary off for reasons we will explain. Now, I'm going to talk to the brilliant Richard Sanders, who's a fantastic journalist who's done incredible work, including for Al Jazeera, but elsewhere, Channel 4. But brilliant, really superb work, which I've spoken to him about, I'll stop speaking about it in the third person, on this channel. So you know how these things work. You've been around in the broadcasting world. Before I talk to you, Richard, I'm just going to show a clip, and it is on the young lad, the young boy, this controversy has focused on. It is Abdullah al-Yazuri, who is 13 years old. He was the narrator of Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, which was on the BBC. And because his father was a technocratic deputy agricultural minister, I believe, the programme was taken off air. Let's just listen to what Abdullah says about this.
My message to the BBC: anything happens to me, BBC is responsible for it. I'm Abdullah al-Yazuri. I'm from Gaza, Palestine, and I contributed to the recent BBC documentary Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, as a narrator. The story is pretty simple. The cameraman had eventually reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to be or to contribute to this documentary, and I accepted. In the contract that was signed between the production company of the documentary and my mother, there wasn't any payment for me or my family. But however, I had $1,000 were transferred to my sister's account, which were for personal spendings, nothing else. And I think it's pretty disappointing, to be honest. Like, I've been working for over 9 months on this documentary for it to just get wiped and deleted. I found about the decision to remove the documentary from the news that were revolving around the movie. And no, I did not receive any apology from BBC.
Richard, just before we talk about what Abdullah al-Yazuri says about, he says, if anything happens to me, the BBC is responsible. Very stark words there. So the BBC would go, well, look, you know, I mean, we know there was a big pro-Israel campaign against it, but they'll go, look, at the end of the day, he's the narrator, this child, and there was undisclosed the fact that he was a deputy agricultural minister in the Hamas administration of Gaza. That's why we pulled it. What would you say to the whole argument that they presented?
Right. Okay. So I have a bunch of thoughts about this. Firstly, let me say that this was by some distance the best thing the BBC had done about Gaza. It properly humanized Palestinians, and it did not take refuge in sort of bogus, asinine two-sidesism. It was very good. It was a very good film. I've got one or two issues with it, but it was a very good film, essentially. Now, my first thought is, why is it always the Palestinian side that is under scrutiny? Why are we never shouting at people because they've shared a platform with the Israeli ambassador, or they have connections to the IDF? It is Israel that is the state that all of the world's leading human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, which is Israeli, have deemed to be guilty of apartheid. It is Israel that is under investigation for genocide by the ICJ, and which Amnesty has concluded is guilty of genocide. Human Rights Watch and the International Criminal Court have concluded that it is guilty of the crime of deliberate starvation. Why is it the victims that are endlessly placed under the most minute and intense moral scrutiny about whether they have the right to speak or not, and not the aggressors, not the perpetrators. Okay, so I have that broad issue. Two, Hamas is an integral part of Palestinian life. When there were last elections in Palestine some time ago, they won. They won in the West Bank and they won in Gaza. They were the government of Gaza. If you are going to say that anyone who is in any way connected with Hamas is persona non grata, cannot be featured at all, you are effectively silencing the Palestinian people, or all but silencing the Palestinian people, which is, of course, the aim of it. Three, it's not in any way a Hamas film. I mean, if I was watching it thinking, it sounds like the script was written by the sort of committee of Hamas, that would be different. I mean, in fact, one of the things that's rather uncomfortable in the film is in the first 5 minutes, you have two people being very hostile to Hamas. It feels rather artificial. I mean, that's not to say there aren't people in Gaza who have those views. I'm sure there are. But it felt rather artificial. So it's not a Hamasi film. As I say, it's a very good film. It's a very good film. Having said all of that, there is an issue of transparency, and they gave their opponents an open goal here. Had I been making the film and had I decided to have that young lad as a presenter, I'd at least have stuck a script line or something in there. There is an issue of transparency here. Now, I think the solution to this, I mean, imagine this the other way around. Imagine this is the other way around, and there's a young Israeli lad we've had taking us around the kibbutzim and so on around the Gaza Strip, and then lo and behold, he's the son of a junior minister in Netanyahu's government. People would have made a fuss, and I think the BBC would have felt obliged to respond. I'm pretty sure the BBC would not have pulled the film, and it would not have done what it has done here, which is very publicly humiliate the production team, place them in a very dangerous, vulnerable situation and position, given the propensity of the Israeli state to kill journalists, and had shown no duty of care to this young lad, whose really only crime is to have this fella as his dad. I think it's quite disgraceful. I think they should have added some sort of line. I think they should have done what they did initially, which they added some sort of line to make clear who the lad was and so on. But I think that the subsequent behaviour has been disgraceful from the BBC.
I mean, it's important to note as well that the script, I mean, he was the narrator. He didn't write the script. So it's not like...
The script is, I mean, you know, one of the things I was slightly uncomfortable about the film with is, you know, why does it have to be children? Why do Palestinians have to be children before we feel sorry for them? But on the other hand, you know, I can see it's an interesting idea to have it through the eyes of children. The script felt like a script that wasn't actually written by the lad. It was written by the production company. I mean, it's quite clear. It's not written by Hamas, which is the sort of insinuation.
But this is a crucial point, isn't it? Because the tenuous argument would be, well, this child may have had his father write the script for, but that he's just the articulator of, you know, he's doing a paid, we'll talk about that. He was supposed to do a paid job basically as a narrator of a documentary. He's not there writing the script about the documentary. That's not how it works. So what the father is actually not actually relevant there, is it? At all.
No, the father has nothing to do with it. I mean, you know, I think when you discover, and the father is the deputy agricultural minister, essentially a technocratic job. I imagine he would be a member of Hamas in order to do that job, but he's certainly not part of the military side of it at all. But as I say, the key point is there's no evidence that the editorial content of the film has been influenced by Hamas in any way. No one is querying the facts and the material that is in the film, and that's the important point.
I mean, the fact that we have a young, barely a teenager, Abdullah al-Yazuri, saying if anything happens to me, the BBC is responsible. Now, I think it's just worth putting those words into context, because we've seen the biggest killing of journalists in any conflict in recorded history in Gaza. And we've also seen the biggest slaughter of children in a conflict in recent times, certainly. And proportionately, you know, we're talking since the Rwandan genocide. I mean, that's the rate of killing in Gaza, as one UN official put it, the worst since Rwanda. So that sentence is not actually hyperbolic at all, is it? I mean, I'm not here to tone police a 13-year-old Palestinian who's been humiliated and dragged through the media like this. It isn't actually crazy. I've been done all my films for Al Jazeera on this topic. I have 5 colleagues who have been killed by the Israelis, and they're not. It's not collateral damage. It's,
if you look at the circumstances of all five, they're hunted down and killed by the Israelis. Journalists in Gaza have this awful thing. Maha Husseini articulates this very well in our film, that not only do they know that their press vests and so on do not protect them, they actually make them a target, and therefore they become responsible for all the people around them. Our bureau chief, Wahel Dadu, his wife, his daughter, his son, his grandson, all killed by the Israelis. So no, I mean, it's far from sort of hypothetical, this, and it's appallingly irresponsible of the BBC just to have essentially thrown the local producers to the wolves, and this kid. It's dreadful behavior. It's appalling behavior, and they just would never behave like that towards Israelis. Again, the presumption that one sort of life is worth more than another sort of life seems to run so deep at the BBC that they're almost not conscious of it. It's extraordinary.
I mean, he notes he works on the documentary for 9 months. There's a little kid in a war zone. It's not a war. I mean, I don't know how to describe it. It's a site of genocide. For 9 months.
Crime scene.
A crime scene. Yeah, that's much better. And they didn't even apologize to him. I mean, that is just, they just did this publicly, and they didn't even, I mean, where's the duty of care? In fact, it's in the BBC charter to have a duty of care towards children in their programming.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely appalling. The treatment of that child and of the local production.
Of course.
The London-based production company have been thrown to the wolves, which I think is all rather unfair, but at least they're not in that sort of physical danger.
I mean, just the broader context, as you say. I mean, look, I did a report about this, obviously, for Dropsite News, about that focused on BBC Online content, but looked wider than that. But it is, what I looked at was based on the testimonies of BBC journalists. I spoke to 13, but it's worth bearing in mind that around 100 BBC journalists signed a letter condemning anonymously the BBC's coverage in terms of being slanted towards Israeli narratives, dehumanizing Palestinians, not treating Palestinian life as anywhere near even the fraction of Israeli life. I mean, that's within this context, you have one documentary which goes against the grain. You get a massive pro-Israel campaign led by people who said despicable things on social media, which are gratuitously, awful bigotry. And then they pull it. I mean, in that wider context, it's not good for the BBC, is it? It's not looking good.
That's very depressing, because with this documentary, one felt that perhaps the BBC was starting to redeem itself. It sort of seen the light. It had realised it had got itself on the wrong side of history with this, and then they just cave in absolutely all over again. I know there's a documentary sitting on the shelf at the BBC. I think it was going out on some sort of streaming service or something about the destruction of the health service, and I'm presuming it's going to go out in the next few days. But we all ought to keep an eye on that, because it's not appeared yet, and it should have appeared by now. So I think the BBC has gone scurrying back into its hole on this. And you're right. I mean, there is a point here. David Collier produced the dossier which led to all this. David Collier was also one of the leading people in the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I think there was a perception in the press at the time that these were all bold, fearless campaigners against racism. In as much as they interacted with Israel at all, they were nice, hand-wringy, liberal Zionists. Okay, they are not. They are right-wing, red in tooth and claw Zionists whose principal preoccupation is Israel. David Collier is a vitriolic, very aggressive supporter of Israel. Many of the others involved in the campaign against Corbyn were far worse. I mean, as in the Labour files we showed, they actually had connections.
I can quote David Collier here. Here's a tweet from February 2024. Our media and politicians active. Palestinians have no agency and everything just happens to them. Palestinians are innocent. Hamas are aliens. The truth, Hamas are Palestinians. The Palestinians voted Hamas. The Palestinians supported Hamas. The Palestinians celebrated October 7th. There's no attempt there to disguise his belief in collective guilt of the Palestinian people. That's just a completely reasonable interpretation of the words I've just summed up.
Unfortunate things about this is we are now back to the dynamic where the Palestinians, who are the victims, are considered the people who are morally questionable, who must be scrutinized, and people like David Collier become the moral arbiters. It's an absurd and frankly racist sort of paradigm, and it's taken us right back to that when we were beginning to crawl away from it.
Do you think, I mean, just a couple of other things in terms of the chilling effect? I mean, do you worry that with the BBC having really done such a terrible job in just accurately informing the not just the British public, the international public, because the BBC is a global broadcaster, about what's actually happening, and you know, and the due impartiality as you know, that's what they're supposed to achieve. And that this is just a massive, because now people at the BBC go, don't, you know, we tried it, we did our little token effort here, it didn't work, avoid.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people like that in the BBC, that they succeed in casting this as perilous terrain. It's just more trouble than it's worth. Let's not go there. Now, and I think that chilling effect then begins to spill out. On Wednesday night, I was at the Royal Television Society Awards. My film Gaza was up for the Current Affairs International. Didn't win. Another very, very good al-Yazuri film won. Now, the penultimate award of the night was meant to be a special recognition award for Gazan journalists, and it got pulled at the last minute. And they were quite clear. They sent an email. The sort of board of the RTS sent an email around to all the jurors saying it was because of the furore over the BBC film. They said, we don't want to add fuel to the fire. Now, I think this is quite astonishingly cowardly of the RTS, and it's an insult, frankly, to all those journalists in Gaza. We all stood there. We all had a minute's silence for the well over 100 journalists killed in the last year, 70% of whom are killed in Gaza. There were lots of sort of, you know, speeches about the importance of a free media and so on. A number of the awards were for films that were about Gaza, and everyone stood up and clapped and expressed solidarity. For the RTS to pull this award at the last minute is just so insulting. It's so insulting to my 5 dead colleagues and their families, and it really exposes the sort of shallow sanctimony of the British journalistic establishment that feels it can do a bit of hand wringing and that's it, that's fine. But when it comes to the crunch, every time they back off. When it matters, every time they back off.
And this, I'd say, underlines why your work is so important. The documentaries that you've been making, which are the sort of documentaries which the BBC should be doing if it was a properly functioning broadcaster. I mean, just finally, I mean, look, you've worked in this industry for so many decades. How do you think history is going to judge the role of mainstream media outlets across the board in the West? I
think it'll judge them appallingly. I think for some years now, history will be totally bewildered by why it is, and the anti-racist spotlight, the moral scrutiny, the hostile coverage is always directed towards the victims of apartheid, of ethnic cleansing, and now of genocide. And while the perpetrators, the aggressors, are welcome in TV studios around the world, and this goes back to the Corbyn period, it was the same, and are accepted as the moral arbiters of Palestinians. They're accepted as the people who can point the finger at Palestinians and call them racist and so on. I mean, Palestinians always, you know, the Palestinian dish, makluba, which you make by turning upside down. Palestinians always refer to this makluba world where they are patently the victims of the most brutal, aggressive racism, and yet it is they who are accused of racism by their racist oppressors. It's grotesque, and it will be seen as grotesque in decades to come.
Amen to that. Richard, brilliant stuff. I think you set out very clearly the very damning conclusions that we need to draw about the BBC's behaviour. So everyone do get the message out. It's important we put this in context, and I've spoken to an expert who understands how the industry works, so I think that's very useful. So press like, subscribe, leave comments, because all that's good for the algorithm, then more people listen to Richard. But Richard, thanks for your brilliant work as ever.
Thank you for having me.